The courtroom was bustling with the energy of anticipation. The low hum of conversations, the shuffle of papers, the sharp clicking of heels on the polished marble floors. All of it filled the space, yet it felt strangely empty. At the center of this charged atmosphere sat a woman who appeared almost invisible. Her presence was understated, even muted. Dressed in a simple black dress that seemed to blend into the surroundings, her pale skin and composed demeanor made her seem smaller than she was. She didn't raise her eyes as she sat in the defendant's chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as though the weight of the world had been placed there and she was content to bear it in silence. On the opposite side, her ex-husband sat tall and proud, an image of confidence and control. The man radiated power, a successful businessman with a wealth that extended far beyond what anyone in the room could comprehend. His dark suit fit perfectly, his tie crisp, his posture impeccable. The very picture of a man who had everything in life, who was used to getting his way. His arrogance was palpable, not just in the way he sat, but in the way he spoke to his lawyer, in the way he occasionally glanced at the woman as if she were nothing more than an afterthought. In the weeks leading up to the trial, he had made it clear to anyone who would listen that this was going to be a quick and easy affair. After all, what was there to contest? He had the money, the power, the connections. She had nothing. The judge entered, and the noise in the room died down immediately. The woman didn't move, didn't even shift in her seat, as though she were waiting for something to happen, something she knew was about to unfold, but couldn't yet put into words. The judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense reputation, surveyed the room with a sharp, almost predatory gaze. She settled her eyes on the woman first, then glanced at her ex-husband. Her expression softened momentarily before she began to speak. "You stand here today seeking a divorce settlement, madam," she said, her voice booming in the otherwise silent room. The woman nodded once, acknowledging the statement. "Your husband has presented his case, claiming a fair and reasonable distribution of assets. Can you provide any reason why that should not be the case?" The ex-husband's lawyer, a slick man with a well-groomed beard, immediately jumped in. "Your Honor, my client has already offered a more than generous settlement. He has requested that his wife be given a substantial sum, more than she's entitled to under the law, as a sign of goodwill. He has no intention of dragging this out." The judge nodded, turning her gaze back to the woman. "And what say you?" There was a pause. The woman didn't answer immediately. She merely sat there, her face unreadable. The room waited in silence, the air thick with anticipation. Her lawyer, a middle-aged man with a calm and composed demeanor, spoke for her. "Your Honor, we do not dispute that a settlement is required," he said quietly. "But we do contest the terms under which my client should be bound. We believe the assets were not fully disclosed and that certain financial matters were handled in a manner that unfairly disadvantages my client." The judge's brow furrowed, clearly taken aback. "Are you suggesting that your client has been deceived? That there's been some form of financial misconduct?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "We believe there are irregularities, Your Honor, and we are requesting a thorough review of the financial documents." The ex-husband scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Irregularities?" he laughed. "There are no irregularities. I've made everything clear. I've been more than fair. There's nothing to review." The woman's lawyer didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he gave a small nod. "We respectfully request that the court allow us to submit additional documents for review. It will become clear upon inspection that my client has been misled." The ex-husband's eyes narrowed. He was unshaken, too accustomed to having the upper hand, to the idea that he could walk into any room and control the situation. The judge, though, seemed to think differently. She gave a curt nod and instructed that the additional documents be submitted for the next session, setting the date for a follow-up. As the court session drew to a close, the woman didn't move immediately. She lingered in her seat, her expression unchanged, though her mind was working at a pace that no one could see. Her ex-husband, on the other hand, stood up immediately, shaking hands with his lawyer, smiling to his colleagues in the room as though he had already won. He glanced briefly at her, his eyes filled with that same smugness, before turning to exit the courtroom. The woman's lawyer didn't speak to her as they gathered their things. He knew better than to disturb her thoughts. She had already said everything that needed to be said, but now the real work was about to begin. The next move had already been set into motion, and all the pieces would fall into place, one by one. The courtroom had seen nothing yet. Later that evening, the woman sat alone at a small table in her apartment, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the otherwise silent room. She opened a manila folder in front of her, filled with financial statements, bank records, and other documents. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic outbursts. She worked in silence, her fingers moving deftly over the papers, sorting them, cross-referencing the figures, making notes. This was the quiet work of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Every document she reviewed brought her closer to the truth, a truth her ex-husband had tried so desperately to hide. She didn't need to confront him yet. She didn't need to make a scene. The next day, she met with her lawyer. They discussed strategy, carefully weighing each step, each piece of evidence, before making their next move. It wasn't about impulsiveness or emotional reactions. It was about precision. Each document, each scrap of evidence had to be presented at exactly the right moment, in the right way, to build the case. The woman had been planning this for months, quietly and without fanfare. Her ex-husband, in his arrogance, had underestimated her. He thought her silence was submission. He thought her meekness was weakness. But every calculated move she made was bringing her closer to a victory he would never see coming. As the days passed, the woman began to notice the subtle shifts. The ex-husband had become increasingly erratic. He began to make subtle threats, trying to push her into a corner. But every time he did, she remained calm. She didn't rise to his provocations. She didn't fight back. She didn't need to. Her weapon was something far stronger than anger. It was the law. It was the truth. And most of all, it was the patience that came with knowing that all things would eventually be revealed. The final blow would come when he least expected it. The woman's bank statement, which had been a quiet part of her strategy, was ready to be revealed. It wasn't just any bank statement. It was the key to unraveling everything. It contained a sum far larger than her ex-husband ever imagined, a fortune hidden in plain sight. There was no escaping the evidence now. The courtroom had seen only the surface of the case, but the woman had been building her case in the shadows, one piece at a time. And as she prepared to bring the evidence forward, she knew that this was just the beginning. The real test would come when she revealed the truth that her ex-husband had worked so hard to keep buried. And when that moment came, his empire of lies would come crashing down. The woman was ready, and when the time came to strike, she wouldn't have to say a word. The evidence would speak for itself. The woman sat at her desk, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, the hum of traffic and the distant chatter of life outside her window serving as a reminder that the world continued without her. Inside, the atmosphere was different, silent, still, and filled with purpose. She didn't need to raise her voice to demand attention. All that mattered now was what lay on her desk, the carefully prepared stack of papers, each one representing a step toward her goal. The world around her might not know it yet, but the battle was already being fought, and the first moves had already been made. She didn't show it, but this had been years in the making. The meticulous planning, the hours of research, the quiet phone calls with financial experts, all those late nights spent combing through endless spreadsheets and legal documents. It had all led to this moment. She had kept her thoughts to herself, her plans concealed, while the world assumed her to be little more than a passive observer. But that was the beauty of it. No one expected a thing. Her ex-husband had made a dangerous mistake by underestimating her. He had always seen her as someone who could be ignored, someone whose silence was an invitation to dominate. He had assumed that the quiet woman sitting in that courtroom was the same woman he had dismissed for years, timid, compliant, and unaware of her own worth. But that woman was gone. In her place was someone far more calculated, far more patient, and far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. The days between the initial court session and the next were spent in solitude, but that didn't mean she was idle. Every single moment, every glance at her phone, every conversation with her lawyer was part of strategy. She wasn't rushing. She didn't need to. The slow, methodical nature of her preparation was what made it so powerful. She knew that rushing into action, reacting too quickly, would only play into her ex-husband's hands. He expected drama. He expected confrontation. He expected her to lash out in anger. What he didn't expect was the cold, calculated precision with which she was operating. The plan had been set long before the divorce papers were even filed. She didn't need to make any grand gestures. She would let the evidence do the talking. Each day, she grew more and more aware of the weight of her own silence. It wasn't a silence born of fear or indecision. It was a silence of control, of quiet power that allowed her to observe and absorb every detail of the ongoing battle. She had spent years watching her ex-husband from the sidelines. He was, after all, a man of habits. He had a routine, a pattern of behavior that could be anticipated if only one was patient enough to observe. And so she watched. She knew when he would be at his office, when he would attend meetings, when he would take his calls. She knew the ins and outs of his business dealings, the relationships he had with his colleagues, and the deals he made under the table. She had always known. She had just chosen not to act on it. Until now, her lawyer, a quiet man who had long since learned not to ask too many questions, had been brought in as a trusted partner in this long game. Together, they reviewed every detail, every document, and every strategy. The lawyer had been the one to help her gather the evidence, the one who had given her the tools to do what was necessary. But she had always been the one pulling the strings, the one guiding the direction of their efforts. He knew that she was a woman who could not be easily swayed, someone who would do whatever was necessary to get what she deserved. He had seen the fire behind her calm exterior, and though he had never said it out loud, he understood the depth of her resolve. The woman never questioned herself. She never doubted her strategy. In fact, she rarely questioned anything at all. She knew the law. She understood how systems worked, and she had the patience to wait for the right moment to strike. Her ex-husband had always been the type to act on impulse, to make bold moves without considering the consequences. He believed that his wealth and power would protect him from any fallout. What he didn't realize was that his biggest mistake was assuming she was powerless. His arrogance had blinded him to the fact that he was, in many ways, his own worst enemy. As the days passed, the gap between the first and second hearings grew shorter. But still, there was no sign of panic. The woman didn't hurry. She spent her time in the quiet corners of her apartment or in the park across the street, quietly watching life unfold and observing how others moved through the world. Her patience was her greatest asset. She knew that the time would come when she would need to act, but she wasn't yet ready to reveal her hand. Instead, she continued to build her case piece by piece, focusing on the details, the things her ex-husband had assumed no one would notice. She knew that the truth was often hidden in plain sight, and all it took was the right lens to see it. The second court date arrived with little fanfare. Her ex-husband was dressed impeccably as always, his confident air surrounding him like an impenetrable wall. His lawyer had grown even more assured in their tactics, believing that the previous session had been nothing more than a formality. But the woman could see it. The small cracks were beginning to appear. She wasn't rushing, but she was building momentum piece by piece. Her ex-husband's complacency was his greatest weakness. He had no idea how much ground he had already lost. The man had grown comfortable, and in his comfort, he had allowed his guard to drop. The woman knew exactly how to exploit that, and so she waited, silently observing as the pieces of her plan clicked into place. When the time came for her lawyer to present the documents, her ex-husband's lawyer scoffed. "What is this?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Another one of these baseless accusations?" But the woman knew that this time, the tables were turning. She remained still, calm, never showing a hint of emotion. As her lawyer handed over the documents, there was no immediate reaction from the opposing side. The ex-husband sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable for the first time. The judge scanned the papers briefly, her brows furrowing in concentration. And then it happened. The first of the cracks in her ex-husband's carefully constructed facade began to show. The documents, carefully gathered and cross-referenced, spoke for themselves. They were undeniable. The man who had once been untouchable, who had controlled everything around him, suddenly found himself facing a truth that he had never anticipated. The room seemed to grow stiller with each passing moment. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but the effect was far more powerful. His eyes flickered with uncertainty as he began to understand. She had known it all along. The financial irregularities, the hidden assets, the discrepancies in the transactions, they were all laid bare before him now. She hadn't had to make a single accusation, hadn't needed to raise her voice or throw accusations. She had simply allowed the truth to unfold on its own. There was no escaping it now. Her ex-husband shifted in his seat, and for the first time, there was a palpable tension in the room. The tables had begun to turn, not because of anything that she had said or done, but because of what she had quietly prepared. She had known all along that the system would work in her favor if she played her cards right. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to act impulsively. She simply needed to wait for the truth to reveal itself, one piece at a time. And in that moment, she knew that the battle was no longer in his hands. It had shifted, and with it, so had the balance of power. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension as the second hearing of the divorce case unfolded. The woman, her posture as unyielding as it had been in the previous session, sat with her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze never straying from the proceedings. Despite the weight of the moment, despite the magnitude of what was at stake, she remained an enigma, silent, composed, and, to an outsider, seemingly insignificant. Her ex-husband, however, was a study in arrogance. He sat across from her, as confident as ever, as though the evidence that had been revealed in the previous hearing had not even made a dent in his unshakable belief in his own superiority. Her ex-husband's lawyer had immediately seized on the documents presented by her lawyer, attempting to downplay them, dismissing them as little more than clerical errors. They had argued in circles, trying to create doubt in the judge's mind, casting aspersions on the validity of the evidence. The woman's lawyer, calm and unflappable, had presented the case with an almost surgical precision, leaving no room for doubt. The judge, a woman who had seen her fair share of contentious divorces, remained focused. Yet the power in a room was shifting slowly, almost imperceptibly. Today, the ex-husband was no longer just the towering figure he had been in the first session. His earlier bravado, his confidence in controlling the outcome, was now beginning to crack. For the first time, the woman could see him growing uneasy, his sharp glances shifting from the documents to her lawyer, and then back to her. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that this would be an easy victory. But now, the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke, the way his eyes flickered to the judge, all betrayed a growing awareness that the tide was turning against him. It had taken years of careful observation to get to this point, years of watching his habits, his weaknesses, and his vulnerabilities. She had seen it all, the way he reacted to pressure, the way he used his wealth and connections to shield himself from consequences. But she had also seen the cracks in his facade, the arrogance, the disregard for the law, the underestimation of her. She knew exactly how to navigate his world, how to manipulate the very system he had used to build his empire. It wasn't about emotions or grand confrontations. It was about precision, about timing. She had learned long ago that people like her ex-husband were driven by their own image, their own need to maintain control. And the way to defeat them was not through force or anger, but through quiet, methodical strategy. The judge, after reviewing the documents presented, finally turned to the ex-husband. There was no smug smile this time, no air of invincibility. Instead, his eyes were tight, his jaw clenched, as if he were bracing for something. The woman could see the shift in him, and though her expression remained as stoic as ever, a small sense of satisfaction stirred inside her. This was what she had been waiting for, The moment when the man who had once controlled everything would begin to realize he was losing control. The judge's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Thompson," she began, addressing the ex-husband by his last name, "I believe we need to address these discrepancies immediately. Can you explain why the financial records submitted in the initial hearings do not match the statements now presented by the defendant's legal team?" His lawyer jumped in quickly, attempting to smooth things over. "Your Honor, there must be some misunderstanding. These are minor errors, unintentional discrepancies that have been blown out of proportion. We are prepared to offer further documentation to clarify these points." But the judge was already growing impatient. She turned to her clerk and gave an order to pull up the financial documents on the screen. The cold light of the projector flickered on, displaying pages of financial transactions, bank statements, and investment records, documents that were becoming increasingly difficult to refute. The woman had seen it all. She had spent countless hours poring over every last detail, ensuring that each piece of evidence was not only accurate but damning. It was a masterclass in precision, and now it was all laid bare before them. The ex-husband shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously on the wooden table. His eyes, once filled with disdain, were now clouded with a mix of confusion and irritation. He could feel the walls closing in, and for the first time in the proceedings, he was not in control. This was not the easy victory he had envisioned when he first filed for divorce, confident that his wealth and status would ensure a quick and painless resolution. He had never imagined that the woman sitting across from him, whom he had once dismissed as insignificant, would be the one to unravel everything he had built. His lawyer continued to protest, but the damage had already been done. The more they tried to explain away the discrepancies, the more they drew attention to them. The judge, who had initially seemed neutral, was now leaning forward, scrutinizing the documents with increasing intensity. There was a noticeable shift in her demeanor, a growing sense of doubt about the ex-husband's integrity. The woman's lawyer, seizing the moment, stood to speak again. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and unwavering, "I submit that these discrepancies are not minor mistakes, but indicative of a pattern of deliberate obfuscation designed to hide assets and manipulate financial records for personal gain. We have reason to believe that these actions are not isolated incidents, but part of a larger scheme that has been going on for years." The ex-husband's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to object, but no words came out. It was as though his confidence had been drained from him piece by piece. The quiet, understated woman across from him had not only exposed his lies, but had managed to do so in such a way that there was no room left for him to maneuver. His reputation, built on years of careful manipulation and calculated risk, was beginning to crumble. The woman had not attacked him directly. She had simply let the truth unfold, layer by layer, until there was nothing left for him to hide behind. The judge was now clearly unsettled. Her sharp eyes moved from the documents to the ex-husband, her expression hardening. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice cold and unforgiving, "I suggest you take a moment to consider the gravity of the situation. This is not simply a matter of financial discrepancies. These are serious allegations that could have far-reaching consequences. If these actions are proven to be intentional, there will be legal ramifications beyond the scope of this divorce case." The woman did not respond, did not make a single move, but inside, she could feel the tide turning. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when the law, the system, and the truth would finally expose the man who had once believed himself untouchable. Her ex-husband, who had spent years manipulating those around him, was now facing the one thing he could not control: the weight of his own lies. The ex-husband's lawyer, now visibly rattled, leaned in to whisper something in his ear, but the man hardly seemed to hear him. His gaze was locked on the documents, his mind racing, scrambling to find a way out. But there was no escape. The woman had made sure of it. She had known from the very beginning that the truth was on her side, and now, with each passing moment, her ex-husband was realizing just how deep his deceit ran. The judge, having seen enough, leaned back in her chair and addressed the room. "This case will be adjourned until further investigation can be conducted. We will reconvene once the full scope of these discrepancies has been examined. Mr. Thompson, you are advised to cooperate fully with the court's request for additional documentation. If you fail to do so, further legal action may be taken. The ex-husband's shoulders slumped as the gravity of the situation sank in. The woman, for her part, remained as poised as ever. She had not needed to raise her voice, not needed to confront him in anger. She had allowed the truth to do the work, and in doing so, she had turned the tables on a man who had once held all the power. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the woman stood up, her lawyer by her side, but she did not look back at her ex-husband. There was no need for words, no need for dramatic gestures. Her victory, for now, was complete, and her ex-husband, once so sure of himself, was left to face the slow unraveling of everything he had fought to protect. The tension in the courtroom that day was palpable, yet it was not the kind of tension one would expect from a dramatic confrontation. No voices were raised, no accusations were flung. Instead, there was a heavy, almost suffocating silence as the proceedings continued. The woman sat in her usual spot, her demeanor unwavering, her gaze focused ahead. She had not come to this point through haste or force. Every step she had taken had been deliberate, measured, and calculated. She had known from the moment she began this process that it would not be a swift victory. This was going to be a war of attrition, and she was prepared for the long game. Across from her, her ex-husband sat just as he always had, poised, seemingly unbothered by the developments in the case. His posture, though slightly less confident than it had been in the earlier days of the trial, was still one of undeniable arrogance. He had always relied on his ability to dominate situations with his wealth and influence, and while he had begun to feel the pressure of the growing evidence, he was still convinced that his money, his connections, could protect him. He had never seen her as a threat, not truly. And even now, as the case began to turn against him, he still held onto the hope that the tide would change in his favor. He was wrong. The hearing that day was critical. It was the moment when the true scope of the discrepancies would be exposed, when the cracks in his empire would begin to widen. The documents, the ones that had slowly begun to unravel his financial misdeeds, were now under intense scrutiny. The woman's lawyer, as composed and focused as always, stood before the judge and began to outline the irregularities in greater detail. The ex-husband's lawyer, who had been dismissive in the previous sessions, now found himself scrambling. He attempted to discredit the documents, to downplay their significance, but the evidence was irrefutable. Every number, every transaction, every misstep was clear, and it painted a picture of someone who had deliberately attempted to hide assets, to obscure the truth. The woman remained silent, her face unreadable. It was not that she didn't feel the gravity of the situation. It was that she knew exactly what was happening. She knew the cracks were starting to show, and the man who had been so sure of his position was beginning to realize that he was losing control. The emotional game was not hers to play. It was his. She had learned long ago that the most powerful weapon was not a sudden outburst or a dramatic accusation, but the quiet certainty that everything would eventually come to light. Her ex-husband's body language had changed in subtle but significant ways. The slight twitch of his fingers, the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered nervously between the documents and the judge. He could no longer maintain the confident, composed facade he had once worn so easily. His arrogance, once his greatest asset, was now his liability. As the lawyer tried to deflect, his arguments became less coherent, his words less convincing. The judge, who had been calm and reserved until now, began to show signs of impatience. "Mr. Thompson," the judge said, her voice laced with a new edge, "it is becoming increasingly clear that the financial records you have presented to the court do not align with the evidence provided by the defendant's legal team. These are not simple discrepancies. They indicate a deliberate attempt to misrepresent assets and income." The woman's ex-husband flinched at the mention of deliberate, his eyes narrowing as the weight of the accusation settled on him. The room seemed to shrink around him, the reality of his situation becoming impossible to ignore. His lawyer attempted one last defense, claiming that the discrepancies were due to simple clerical errors. But it was clear to everyone in the room that these were not mistakes born of human error. These were deliberate, calculated acts of deception, acts he had believed he could hide behind his wealth and connections. The woman could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't a sudden dramatic turn. Rather, it was the slow, inevitable collapse of a man's self-assurance. The more he fought, the more the evidence mounted against him. Each attempt to brush the issues aside only made them more visible, more undeniable. And with each passing moment, the ex-husband's once impenetrable armor began to crack. The woman's strategy had always been to present the evidence without fanfare, to let the truth do the work for her. And now it was working. As the judge continued to ask questions, the ex-husband's discomfort grew. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting around the room, as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. His lawyer, now visibly flustered, tried to maintain control of the situation, but it was clear that the damage had been done. The more they attempted to downplay the discrepancies, the more the judge's skepticism grew. The woman's lawyer, who had been calm throughout, spoke again, presenting even more damning evidence. This time, it wasn't just the financial records that were under question. The documents revealed a web of investments, shell companies, and hidden assets that had been systematically hidden from view. There was no way to explain these away. There was no way to dismiss them as mere errors. The ex-husband had built an empire not only on his wealth, but on deception, and now that empire was crumbling piece by piece. The ex-husband's confidence was all but gone now. His shoulders were hunched. His eyes no longer met the judge's gaze. His head hung low, as though he could no longer bear the weight of the truth that was being laid out before him. The man who had once commanded every room, who had been the center of attention wherever he went, was now shrinking under the weight of his own lies. For the first time in the entire proceedings, the woman could see that he was afraid. He had never been afraid of her. He had never considered her a real threat. But now, he was terrified, not of her, but of the consequences of his actions, of the unraveling of his reputation and his wealth. The woman's gaze never left him, but there was no satisfaction in her eyes. She had never been motivated by the need for revenge. What mattered to her now was not the man who sat before her, but the truth that had to be revealed. She had never expected him to be a noble man, nor had she ever hoped for him to change. What mattered to her was that the system, the law, the truth would eventually hold him accountable. She had known that his downfall would not come through some grand confrontation, but through his own actions. His arrogance had been his greatest weapon, but it had also been his greatest flaw, and now it was destroying him. The judge finally spoke again, her voice steady but firm. "Mr. Thompson, this case has gone beyond the matter of a simple divorce settlement. There are serious legal issues at hand now. You are hereby advised to fully cooperate with the court's investigation into these financial discrepancies. If this evidence is substantiated, you could be facing charges far more serious than what is currently on the table." The ex-husband looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. The arrogance, the control, the dominance, everything he had taken for granted was now slipping away. The woman had not shouted, had not demanded anything from him. She had simply watched, waited, and allowed the law to do its work. As the session concluded, the woman stood to leave. She did not look back at him. There was no need. He had already lost. He had not lost to her. He had lost to his own arrogance, to his own disregard for the law, and to his underestimation of her. The truth had a way of cutting through even the most well-crafted facades, and now, all that was left was the slow, inevitable collapse of everything he had worked so hard to build. The woman's steps were quiet as she walked out of the courtroom. She had won not through emotion or impulsiveness, but through a quiet determination, a methodical patience that had outlasted her ex-husband's arrogance. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. The woman didn't need to say anything more. Her silence had already spoken volumes. And in that silence, her victory had been sealed. The courtroom had grown quieter in the days following the previous hearing, as though everyone present understood the gravity of what had been set in motion. The ex-husband, once a man who carried an air of invincibility wherever he went, now walked with his head lowered, his confidence shattered by the mounting evidence against him. It was no longer just about a divorce settlement. It was no longer about a division of assets or alimony. The case had escalated, and the man who had thought he could control the situation with money and influence now found himself cornered by his own mistakes. For the woman, there was no satisfaction in his discomfort, no triumph in seeing him unravel. She had long ago stopped expecting anything from him. She had known him perhaps better than anyone else, and she had understood from the very beginning the way he operated. His pride, his arrogance, his need to dominate every situation. These were things that had once drawn her to him, but also things that had led to their downfall. The woman had never expected him to be anything other than what he was. She didn't need to see him suffer. She didn't need to see him squirm. What she needed was for him to face the consequences of his actions, for the truth to be revealed in full, for the system to work as it was meant to. In the weeks that followed, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The next hearing was approaching, and while her ex-husband attempted to put on a show of bravado in public, privately, he was unraveling. The legal documents he had once waved away as inconsequential were now being examined under a magnifying glass. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The discrepancies in his financial records were not just mistakes. They were deliberate actions designed to hide assets, evade taxes, and conceal income. His once carefully constructed empire, built on his public image and wealth, was now being picked apart, piece by piece, by a system he had believed he could control. The woman, however, remained the same, silent, composed, methodical. She did not need to respond to his attempts at intimidation or his occasional outbursts in court. She had learned long ago that people like him thrived on drama, on conflict, on the emotional chaos they could create. She had no intention of giving him the satisfaction of a response. Her silence, her restraint, her calmness, it was all part of her strategy. While he floundered, attempting to salvage what was left of his reputation, she moved forward with a quiet precision. Her lawyer, a man who had come to admire her unwavering focus, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering additional evidence and preparing for the next round of hearings. Every step was carefully planned. Every document, every piece of evidence, every witness, it was all part of the larger picture she was painting. And the more her ex-husband tried to distract, the more he attempted to play his games, the clearer it became that he was out of his depth. As the date for the next hearing loomed, the ex-husband's lawyers began to grow desperate. They knew that the case was slipping away from them. There was no way to explain the growing pile of evidence against him. His financial dealings, which had once seemed so expertly hidden, were now laid bare for all to see. He had relied on the idea that his wealth would protect him, that his ability to manipulate the system would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But what he hadn't counted on was the woman's quiet resolve, her ability to wait and strike when the moment was right. He had underestimated her, and now, every move he made only seemed to make a situation worse. The woman's lawyer presented the new evidence in court with the same quiet confidence that had become their trademark. It wasn't dramatic or flashy. It didn't need to be. The evidence spoke for itself. There were no wild accusations, no emotional pleas. There was only the truth, carefully laid out in front of the judge. Her ex-husband's investments, once thought to be legitimate, were now revealed as part of an elaborate network of shell companies and hidden assets. The numbers didn't lie. His actions, once believed to be clever, were now clearly illegal, and there was no way out for him. Her ex-husband tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear that he was losing ground. His once smooth, confident tone faltered as he tried to refute the evidence. His lawyer's objections were growing weaker, more defensive. The judge, who had been initially skeptical of the woman's claims, was now starting to see the full extent of the situation. The man who had once seemed so untouchable was now a man who was backed into a corner, trying to fight a battle he could no longer win. The woman, for her part, said nothing. She didn't need to. She had known from the start that this moment would come. She had known that the truth would eventually win out, that the lies would be exposed. What she had done, and what she continued to do, was simply allow the system to work. She had no desire to humiliate her ex-husband, no desire for revenge. What she wanted was for justice to be served. And that was exactly what was happening. In the days following the hearing, the fallout was swift. News outlets began to pick up the story, their headlines filled with the words financial misconduct, embezzlement, and fraud. The man who had once been a prominent figure in business circles was now the subject of public ridicule. His reputation, carefully built over years, had been shattered in an instant. His peers, his colleagues, the people who had once looked up to him, now they began to turn away. Whispers began to spread through the business world, and soon, his connections, once so solid and reliable, began to disintegrate. The empire he had built with such effort was now beginning to crumble, and it was happening faster than he could manage. But even as the world began to turn against him, the woman remained focused. She had no desire to gloat. She had no need to bask in his humiliation. What mattered to her was the process, the fact that he was finally being held accountable for his actions. She knew that this was not the end. The financial ramifications of his actions would take time to unfold, but the groundwork had been laid. The public humiliation, the legal battles, the collapse of his business empire. These were merely the consequences of his own arrogance, of his belief that he was above the law, above accountability. For the woman, there was no grand celebration. There was no dramatic conclusion. She did not need to be the center of attention. The justice she sought had already been delivered. Her ex-husband had lost, not because of anything she had done to him, but because of his own mistakes. She had simply allowed the truth to come to light, and in doing so, had exposed a man who had once held so much power and influence. The days that followed were quiet. The woman continued her life, undisturbed by the chaos that had engulfed her ex-husband. She did not need to acknowledge his fall from grace, nor did she need to confront him. She had won without uttering a word, without raising her voice. The slow, steady collapse of his world was her victory, and it had come not through force, but through the quiet strength of her patience, her persistence, and her commitment to seeing things through. In the end, she had gotten what she wanted. Justice had been served, and the system had worked exactly as it was meant to. Her ex-husband had lost everything, not because of anything she had done to him, but because of the lies he had told, the deceit he had practiced, and the arrogance that had led him to believe he could get away with it. And for the woman, that was enough. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation, no need for a final showdown. The truth had done the work, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The weeks following the explosive revelations in the courtroom were some of the most trying yet transformative moments in the woman's life. The case, which had once seemed like a straightforward divorce settlement, had evolved into something far more complex, far more consequential. What had started as a personal battle for financial fairness and justice was now a larger issue, attracting attention from the legal world, the media, and even law enforcement. Her ex-husband's empire, once a towering monolith of wealth and influence, was crumbling rapidly, and there was no stopping the domino effect that was unfolding. What had once seemed invincible was now slowly breaking apart. It was all because of his own choices he had made while underestimating her, while thinking that his power would protect him. She had, by all accounts, expected this. From a very first day, she began to prepare for this moment. She had known that the truth would ultimately catch up with him, but it was still surreal to witness the way everything was unfolding so quickly, like an avalanche, unstoppable and all-encompassing. The media coverage had been relentless, with every publication across the country running stories about the financial misconduct and fraud that had been uncovered. Headlines read like something out of a corporate thriller. CEO under investigation for fraud, business tycoon's financial empire crumbles, and, perhaps most poignantly, ex-wife's legal strategy dismantles billion-dollar empire. The media painted a picture of the ex-husband as a man brought low by his own greed and deception. But for her, there was no sense of satisfaction in seeing the world turn against him. It was just the inevitable conclusion of a story that had been in the making for years. For her, it wasn't about revenge. It had never been. It was always about ensuring that justice was done and that the truth would prevail. She had been a silent observer for so long, watching as he manipulated the system, watching as he wove a web of lies to protect himself, and all the while, underestimating her, believing she would always remain in the background. He had assumed she would remain quiet, compliant, never challenging the narrative he had constructed around their marriage, around their business dealings, around their lives. But she had been watching. She had been observing every small detail, every inconsistency, and she had known that eventually it would all fall apart. And now it was happening. The once powerful man, who had sat so arrogantly across from her in the courtroom, was now facing multiple investigations into his business dealings, his personal finances, and his role in orchestrating the schemes that had made him millions while leaving others in the dust. Authorities had begun to probe into his activities, subpoenaing his financial records, tracing the shell companies, and investigating his involvement in fraudulent transactions. He was now the subject of not just civil suits, but potential criminal charges. The banks, once happy to lend to him without question, were now closing in. His investors were pulling out, and his business partners, once so eager to align with him, were distancing themselves. But through it all, she remained steady. She wasn't consumed by the frenzy that now surrounded him. While the media painted him as a fallen mogul, she kept her eyes on the real goal, seeing the system work as it was meant to. It was no longer just about her divorce. The case had become a symbol of accountability, of the idea that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, was above the law. And in that moment, she felt a quiet sense of pride, not in his destruction, but in the fact that she had played a part in bringing that truth to light. It wasn't a victory that could be measured in headlines or applause. It was a victory in the form of justice, in the quiet dismantling of a man who had thought his wealth and influence would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But the fallout wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal, and the woman knew that this had always been the most dangerous part of her ex-husband's downfall. His arrogance had blinded him to the real cost of his actions, the people he had hurt, the lives he had destroyed in his quest for wealth and control. The woman, in contrast, had always been aware of the cost, even when she had been silent. She had watched as he manipulated people, using them as pawns to build his empire. She had seen the way he treated his employees, his colleagues, and, at times, even his own family. The cracks in his character had always been there, but he had hidden them behind a veneer of success and affluence. Now, as the cracks in his empire grew wider, the cracks in his personal life began to show as well. In private, his behavior had started to deteriorate. The once immaculate facade of control he had so carefully maintained was now slipping, and the person beneath was emerging, frantic, defensive, and entirely unrecognizable from the man he had once been. His desperation became increasingly apparent. His calls to her were relentless at first, a mixture of pleading and anger. He tried to manipulate her, attempting to convince her that she had made a mistake, that she was ruining everything, that he could still make it right if she just stopped pushing. His lawyer, sensing the collapse, started making moves to settle the case outside of court, tried to appeal to her sense of fairness, of compromise, but she refused. She knew better than to fall for his pleas. He had spent years manipulating her emotions, using her own vulnerability against her. Now, the roles were reversed, and the woman was no longer susceptible to his charm or his threats.